Hi, and welcome to my channel. Here, I tell stories about serial killers and other high-profile criminal cases. Today, we'll talk about Alexander Spesivtsev, one of the most brutal serial killers in modern Russia. He operated in the mid-1990s in Novokuznetsk and is a rare example of a serial killer who committed his crimes right in his own home, turning a regular apartment in a typical residential building into a torture chamber. He lured victims in and disposed of their bodies there. Why was a maniac with a criminal record and a serious psychiatric diagnosis never even considered a suspect? To help understand this story, I was assisted by journalist and human rights activist Eva Merkacheva, Spesivtsev's former classmate Borden, and Ivan Klanky, who studied the case in detail for several years and spoke with neighbors of the criminal and with the parents of his victims. Alexander Spesivtsev was born on March 1, 1970. At least, that's the date his mother, Lyudmila, gave when registering his birth certificate, 2 years after his actual birth. She gave birth at home and, for the first few years of his life, never once took Alexander to see a doctor.
For 2 years, the child existed illegally, which is very strange because it is known that Soviet and current laws strictly require a birth certificate to be issued promptly for a newborn. There was even a version, which is still hard to confirm or deny, that perhaps he wasn't even their child. It's unknown whether investigators ever conducted a genetic test to determine if he really was theirs. Perhaps the mother had taken him from somewhere.
Alexander was raised by his mother and older sister, Nadezhda. The father, Nikolai, worked in a coal mine, drank heavily, frequently beat his family, and eventually left them when Sasha was 4 years old. The Spesivtsevs then moved to central Novokuznetsk, to 53 Pionersky Prospect, the very apartment that would later become a torture chamber.
It was a nice area right in the city center next to the main square where official events were held. Not the outskirts, not a dangerous neighborhood. A 9-story building. Compared to the private sector outskirts where I grew up, it seemed like the pinnacle of civilization.
Alexander grew up weak and sickly, with poor eyesight and frequent headaches. He was often whiny. Lyudmila worried for her son, and soon her motherly concern turned into overprotection. There are still legends about their strange relationship. It's said that Sasha slept in the same bed with his mother until age 12. Lyudmila didn't let him play outside alone, shielding him from all dangers, and always took his side in any conflict, even when he was clearly in the wrong. Alexander started school where his mother worked as a supply clerk. After she was fired, he transferred to another school and ended up in the same class as Rostislav Borden.
Our homeroom teacher warned us, knowing we had a tradition of giving newcomers a bit of a rough welcome. God forbid you touch him. He gave out Makarov pistol cartridges to people he saw as threatening him. Alexander was a skinny boy with a bowl haircut. Because of his poor eyesight, he was seated in one of the front rows.
According to Rostislav, Alexander barely interacted with anyone in class, earned mediocre grades, and during breaks would sit with his mother, who often brought the teacher's medical notes for his absences. Borden doesn't remember anything particularly strange about Alexander's behavior. He and his mother were simply unremarkable, almost invisible.
In gym class, his teachers didn't push him. If he couldn't do a pull-up, they didn't make a fuss. He got C's. There was no discrimination or special attention to him from the school staff.
He couldn't find common ground with his peers. Judging by his own words, he failed to gain their attention. His stories and interests seemed boring to them. He felt intellectually inferior, unattractive, uninteresting.
In 8th grade, Spesivtsev was nearly expelled from school after he stole electronic parts from the radio room. As always, his mother intervened. Lyudmila pleaded with the teacher's council to let her son stay and at least finish his basic secondary education. By the end of the school year, Lyudmila left the school as well. According to rumors, she was caught stealing, just like her son, and was fired. She soon found work at the courthouse as an assistant to a defense attorney. Her daughter, Nadezhda, helped her get the job. She worked there as a clerk. From that point on, the family developed a new hobby. In the evenings, they would sit together and look through photographs from criminal case files.
These photos depicted crime scenes and murder victims, close-ups, profile shots, and plenty of blood. Mother and son pored over them as if they were browsing a family photo album, like children in a normal household looking at fairy tale illustrations. In my opinion, there were obvious signs of deviant behavior in the mother, possibly rooted in a serious psychiatric disorder. Either way, this was how the family spent their time, and it likely shaped Spesivtsev's neutral or even casual attitude toward crime. To him, it became something possible, something not frightening or taboo. Just as he and his mother looked at crime photos together for amusement, he later brought this entertainment into real life, to see what it would be like.
While teachers may have ignored Sasha and his mother, neighbors couldn't. Spesivtsev often set doorbells on fire, broke mailboxes, stole newspapers, and later even bicycles. When one neighbor scolded him for playing loud music, Spesivtsev jammed matches into her door lock. Any attempts by residents to complain about him to his mother were met with accusations of slander, or even spit in the face.
What played a crucial role in his development was that, even as a teenager committing his first crimes, his mother always covered for him. She truly had strong legal skills from working in the court system and used them to defend him, citing articles of the Criminal Procedure Code invoking technicalities. This worked. As a result, Alexander felt completely safe. With a mother and sister like his, nothing could touch him. That feeling of invulnerability turned into a kind of game, a terrifying game, one that not all people with mental illness would be capable of playing.
After barely finishing 8th grade, Spesivtsev chose not to continue his education. He didn't want to work either. Eventually, after turning 18, he was caught stealing and ended up in pre-trial detention. He managed to avoid prison thanks to a psychiatric evaluation. At one court hearing, he began banging his head against the bars and shouted that he didn't want to go to jail. Doctors declared him insane and diagnosed him with schizophrenia.
They interviewed him several times. He spoke about his childhood, how his father drank and beat him, and how his mother smothered him with overprotective care. He described having severe headaches, feelings of isolation, and an inability to fit into any peer group. He claimed that his actions, his crimes, were just attempts to be accepted by stronger boys, to be close to them, because he always felt weak, gray, and unwanted. His story might have seemed coherent at first glance, but the doctors noticed signs of delusion. They noted that his thoughts included bizarre ideas that could only be explained by mental illness. He spoke of wanting to be the best. He wanted universal recognition, and to prove that he was the ruler of the world, that he could stare fear in the face and endure the kind of hell that no one else could.
In the fall of 1988, Spesivtsev was sent for involuntary treatment at the Novokuznetsk Psychiatric Hospital. His medical record described him as gloomy and quick-tempered. Over time, he began attacking other patients. At the same time, he wrote to his mother, claiming he was being abused. He refused to take medication, skipped his prescribed doses, and after just 6 months, escaped the facility. No one bothered to search for him. However, it wouldn't have been hard. He simply returned to his registered address. Authorities seemed to forget about him entirely. He went back to his idle life. Then, in 1991, he even started a relationship with a 17-year-old girl named Yevgenia, who apparently had no idea about his psychiatric background.
This feeds into the theory that he could switch personalities. It was as if one version of Spesivtsev could behave normally, blending into society and arousing no suspicion from those around him, while the other version demanded blood, power, and everything typically attributed to serial killers.
The romantic phase didn't last long. Soon, their relationship turned into a cycle of nitpicking, accusations, and beatings. After one particularly violent incident, Yevgenia was hospitalized with a head injury. But even that didn't stop Spesivtsev. He stormed into her hospital room and continued to hit her. No one, neither the doctors nor the psychiatrists, called the police. Shortly after being discharged from the hospital, despite her resolve to end the relationship, Yevgenia visited Spesivtsev's apartment. By that time, he was living alone. His mother and sister only visited occasionally. Yevgenia ended up staying in the apartment for an entire month. During that time, her ex-boyfriend repeatedly beat her, cut her with knives, burned her with cigarettes, and starved her. When her parents finally grew alarmed by her disappearance, it was already too late. Yevgenia had died of sepsis.
When Spesivtsev was detained, he claimed he had tried to help her, that she was sick, and he didn't want to inform anyone about her illness, believing he could treat her himself. He said he fed her with a spoon and cared for her. His mother fully backed this version. She said he looked after Yevgenia, that the girl had been weak and bedridden, and that her son had tried to save her.
Spesivtsev was arrested and charged with inflicting serious bodily harm, assault, and leaving a person in danger. His mother once again railed against the authorities just as she had with school officials and neighbors, and even threw stones at the windows of the local prosecutor's office. But this time, her fury had little effect on the outcome. Still, the case never went to trial. Once again, the killer was sent to a psychiatric hospital, and the investigation was suspended.
As is sometimes the case, a person is caught at the scene of a crime, but is in such a mental state that a full forensic psychiatric evaluation can't be performed immediately. First, they need to be stabilized. This was exactly what happened with Spesivtsev. Once he was stabilized, doctors concluded that he was fully aware of his actions. He understood the consequences. He realized he was torturing a person. He knew that person could die. He also knew he could stop at any moment, but chose not to. All of this was confirmed by experts, which is why they deemed him sane and legally responsible.
Spesivtsev was discharged from the hospital. But instead of being returned to pretrial detention and the investigation resumed, he was simply forgotten again. He went right back to his apartment at 53 Pioneersky Prospect.
This kind of bureaucratic negligence was common in the late Soviet and early post-Soviet years. Psychiatric hospitals were overcrowded. If the hospital had room for 100 patients, they might have held 120. And when a 121st was brought in, staff had to decide whom to discharge to make room.
Sometime later, Spesivtsev met a 20-year-old woman named Elena Trunova at the train station. He invited her to his apartment. They had sex, but then an argument broke out. Elena apparently made a comment that offended him, something about his sexual performance. In response, he grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed her twice, once in the chest and once in the stomach. Then he dismembered her body. That was when Spesivtsev's signature emerged. After killing Trunova, he began to intentionally hunt. He would lure victims to his apartment and kill them there.
Some called him a homebody. To him, his apartment wasn't just a home, it was a den, a sanctuary where he performed his bloody rituals. It was very important to him that the victims entered the apartment willingly. That way, he proved to himself that he could manipulate anyone, that he had enough charm, persuasion, and intellect to talk them into walking into their own doom.
In April 1996, Spesivtsev lured a group of 7 teenagers into his home, 5 boys and 2 girls. None of them were older than 14. He had spotted them on the street. They were likely homeless or street kids. He offered them cigarettes and invited them to help him rob an apartment, his own, at 53 Pioneersky Prospect. That's how all 7 ended up in his trap. He killed them all with a knife. Then he stacked their bodies in the hallway and covered them with a cloth.
Teenagers were his preferred victims. First, because he could manipulate them. He was older, they were more trusting, more naive. He often lured them with promises of easy money. In one case, he told a group of kids that he had bars of soap to sell, a valuable item during the shortages of the 1990s. It was believable enough.
He preferred groups, because if there were several kids together, they weren't as afraid. The danger seemed smaller in numbers. He clearly had a sense for who to target and how, and unfortunately he was very good at it. His manipulative skills, honed on his overindulgent mother and sister, were now being used to lure victims to their deaths.
One of Spesivtsev's former classmates nearly became his next victim. They ran into each other in the courtyard. He invited her up to his apartment to listen to music and have coffee. But as they approached the entrance, she suddenly changed her mind and left, unwittingly saving her life. Not long after, Spesivtsev committed another mass murder. This time, 4 children were killed. The youngest of them was just 9 years old.
You might think the victims could have fought back. Maybe 2 of them could have overpowered him while he attacked a third. But they didn't. They did nothing. The paralyzing terror he instilled was one of the most crucial elements of his crimes. It's hard to explain exactly why they reacted the way they did. Perhaps it was the element of surprise. Perhaps something else we'll never fully understand. But more than likely, it was a combination of factors.
Out of all of Spesivtsev's victims, at least 20 in total, only 1 boy managed to escape. That day, he had fought with his parents and went to sleep in a stairwell near a friend's apartment. That friend lived next door to Spesivtsev. The killer noticed the boy by the trash chute. Behind the chute lay the dismembered remains of previous victims. We don't know how long the boy was held captive. But one day he smelled fresh air, realized the front door was open, and made a run for it. He told no one what had happened. And Spesivtsev went right back to committing his bloody rituals.
As in a horror film, Spesivtsev seemed to transform into a beast. One person, one moment, someone entirely different the next. Experts who interviewed him said it sometimes felt like he truly believed he wasn't acting alone, that dark forces were with him during the killings.
One very real accomplice was his mother. When she found the body of Elena Trunova, Spesivtsev's first victim after his release, she dismembered it herself, took the parts out of the apartment, and buried them in a vacant lot. Later, Alexander also began dismembering his victims, but it was Lyudmila who consistently disposed of the remains.
That became her role. It was an unspoken agreement. She took out the body parts. Spesivtsev mostly handled the dismemberment, sometimes even forcing his victims to kill and cut up one another in exchange for promises of freedom. Meanwhile, Lyudmila pretended not to see anything. She would leave the apartment during the killings and return only afterward to remove the pieces. Her role in all of this is arguably the most horrifying. She had multiple chances to stop what was happening. She could have saved many lives, and yet she never did.
In June 1996, human remains were found in the Aba River. On that day, Rostislav Borden, Spesivtsev's former classmate who was now working as a journalist, happened to be nearby. He became one of the official witnesses during the recovery of the body parts.
The current carried them into the bushes on the riverbank. Law enforcement officers were already working at the scene. Before my eyes, a severed limb and other body parts were pulled out of the water. When I asked what's going on, the head of the criminal investigation department said that they had found a chopped-up body. I didn't realize that these were parts of several victims, especially children.
At the time, it was assumed to be the result of a criminal dispute, some kind of gangland killing, perhaps. In 1990's Novokuznetsk, violence was common. People, and even the police, had grown desensitized. No one imagined that the remains could belong to 5 teenagers. There were already nearly 100 minors officially listed as missing in the city. The real number was even higher. Many parents never reported their children missing. Others didn't notice or didn't want to find them.
Even when the parents contacted the police, they could not remember what the children were wearing when they were last seen. That's probably why the investigation didn't have a full-fledged picture.
There were many impoverished families. Some had lost their livelihoods when local factories shut down, leaving their children without supervision. It was a time when street children were everywhere. In Novokuznetsk, for example, there were groups of kids, 10 to 15 years old, who hung out near the train station sniffing glue from plastic bags. That scene was tragically ordinary for the time.
But it wasn't just homeless kids who vanished. Children from seemingly stable families went missing too. Some returned after a while, others were found by police. But for the rest, detectives had no solid leads. They began pursuing even the most far-fetched theories. One idea was that the children had been trafficked into slavery in Chechnya. Another theory blamed local organized crime groups, suggesting they were kidnapping kids for ransom. There was even talk of black market organ traffickers selling children's internal organs. At Novokuznetsk Airport, staff were ordered to search passengers and luggage for anything resembling medical transport containers.
One of the versions was that the gypsies had stolen it. Many people still remembered how, when gypsy families appeared in the area, the residents locked the doors and stood guard.
On September 24, 1996, 3 girls, 13-year-olds Nastya and Zhenya, and 15-year-old Olya, left the hospital ward where they were being treated together. They went for a walk and stopped by a local store to buy batteries for a portable music player. Outside the shop, they encountered an elderly woman who politely asked them for help opening her apartment door. That woman was Lyudmila Spesivtseva. The 4 of them went up to the 9th floor and stopped in front of apartment number 357.
According to Alexander Spesivtsev's later testimony, he ordered his mother to bring him more victims, and she chose these girls. Why them exactly? It's unclear. Perhaps she thought she could manipulate them. They were sweet, trusting, and naive.
When the door opened, Spesivtsev stood there with a large black Newfoundland dog. Lyudmila walked in silently, and Alexander used the dog to intimidate the girls into entering.
The dog played a strange and disturbing role in the story. It was like a participant in the ritual. Supposedly, the dog fed on human flesh. Victims were terrified by it, though Newfoundlands are typically a gentle breed. Still, its sheer size made it frightening. It's hard to say exactly how the dog behaved when Spesivtsev brought victims home. Some believe he trained it to intimidate, which might explain why the victims didn't resist.
As far as I know, he hasn't gone outside with the dog lately. According to neighbors, she's been living on his balcony all the time. But none of the neighbors ever told him to walk around the yard with the dog and scare them.
Spesivtsev introduced himself to the girls as Andrei. He led them into a room, left briefly, and returned holding a syringe. When he began injecting Zhenya with a sedative, she started crying loudly. Nastya grabbed a bottle and tried to hit him with it. In response, Spesivtsev pulled out a knife and stabbed her several times in the chest and stomach. Then he strangled her with tights. After killing Nastya, he forced Zhenya and Olya to dismember the body, carefully separating flesh from bone.
It was very important to him that he scared these people so much that they did those terrible things that no one would normally agree to. And he enjoyed looking at what a person goes through, what emotions he experiences when he saws a body taste human flesh. This is generally a separate story. All this, what he forced other people to do, putting them, as it were, beyond the boundaries of reasonable human, brought him pleasure from the feeling of control over everyone.
From Nastya's remains, Spesivtsev's mother cooked soup and forced the surviving girls to eat it. The remaining body parts she packed into a bag and carried out of the apartment. Zhenya and Olya remained imprisoned in apartment 357 for an entire month. During that time, Spesivtsev constantly raped them, tortured them with the soldering iron, beat them severely, and sewed their wounds shut using ordinary thread. On October 18th, he beat Zhenya to death, all because she failed to find a newspaper with TV listings. Olya tried to save her friend, performing artificial respiration for an hour, but it was too late. For the next 3 days, Spesivtsev did not touch the body. He left the window open, believing that the girl's soul needed time to leave.
He saw himself as someone with a unique gift, someone who could liberate sinful souls through suffering.
3 days later, Spesivtsev ordered Olya to dismember the body of her murdered friend Zhenya. He then told his mother to dispose of the remains. As always, Lyudmila complied. Olya was next. Spesivtsev began torturing her with electric shocks, warning that her death was coming soon. But then, something interrupted the killing. There was a knock at the door. It was municipal utility workers coming to check the heating pipes. Spesivtsev refused to let them in, saying he was mentally ill and couldn't open the door without his mother. The next day, the workers returned, this time with a police officer.
What happened next was pure chance. Had the heating system been working properly, who knows how many more victims there would have been.
There's another version of how Spesivtsev was caught. After the girls went missing, a composite sketch of his mother was created based on witness reports from a local store. A local police officer recognized Lyudmila from the sketch, called in a response team, and that's how they were able to track down the apartment. Either way, by that time, the Novokuznetsk police were already actively searching for a serial killer. Earlier that summer, 70 body fragments belonging to children and teenagers aged 9 to 14 had been discovered in a vacant lot near the Pedagogical Institute. The remains had been carefully dismembered, leading investigators to suspect professional hunters or butchers. They also questioned recently released sex offenders and mentally ill individuals, but Spesivtsev's name wasn't on any list. No one had informed the authorities that a man accused of murder had already been discharged from psychiatric care. Even the investigator handling the case of Spesivtsev's former girlfriend's death hadn't followed up on his treatment progress.
What was the investigator supposed to do? She was supposed to visit the suspect's place of residence and, accordingly, initiate a full investigation, one that should have led to a trial. The investigator issued a summons, but when he didn't show up, she seemingly took no further action to find him. She didn't put him on the wanted list, even though she had the authority to do so. And so, the case quietly faded away. He had been in the hospital, so what? That's where it ended. Of course, this was negligence. And of course, it was a monstrous failure, considering the consequences that followed. There were attempts later to hold the investigator accountable. But in the end, no criminal charges were brought against her. In fact, no one was held responsible.
To enter the apartment, police had to break down the front door. Hearing the commotion, Spesivtsev fled to the balcony and escaped via the fire escape. Inside, investigators were met with a nightmare. In the bathtub, there was a human torso. In a small barrel, they found limbs. In an enameled cooking pot, there was a human head. In one of the rooms, they discovered Olya, chained to a radiator, barely alive.
The hallway was filled with an overpowering stench of decay. There were only 4 apartments on that floor, and yet somehow no neighbors had reported the smell. How could they not have noticed? That remains a mystery to this day. After the arrest, neighbors kept silent, as if in denial.
They had a reputation, a scandalous, unpleasant family that people preferred to avoid. Whatever was going on behind their doors, it was seen as their dark little world, their dark kingdom, But that kind of attitude is exactly what allowed truly horrific things to happen. It wasn't indifference from the neighbors, not really. They were genuinely afraid, for their lives, for their futures, because they knew. A woman like Lyudmila Spesivtseva was capable of anything, from a well-timed malicious report to the authorities to some kind of provocation that could ruin someone's life. People believed she would stop at nothing.
There's a video online of Olya speaking to investigators, describing what happened to her and her friends inside Spesivtsev's apartment. Just a few hours after that recording was made, Olya died of sepsis. Out of respect for her memory, I've chosen not to include that audio in this episode. Please don't watch that video if you're in a vulnerable emotional state. After his escape, Spesivtsev was caught 2 days later. Unable to survive on the street, he returned home. He didn't deny his guilt, but tried to blame the doctors, claiming they had refused him proper treatment. He also made sure to implicate his mother during the very first interrogation.
When investigators questioned Lyudmila, she tried to deny everything. But Alexander gave her up, openly. So much for a son's love for his mother. He said, "I would wake up and the bodies were gone," meaning his mother had a key to the apartment. She would come in, see what Alexander had done, and take the remains with her.
She insisted she only saw buckets, never carried them out, but he calmly replied, "That's not true. You took them out, all of them."
I once spoke with some forensic experts, and they were genuinely shocked by the way the bodies had been dismembered. They told me that some of the remains looked like they'd been handled by a surgeon, precise, almost clinical. But other parts, it was like someone had just taken a saw and hacked straight through bone. They were convinced the dismemberment had been done by 2 different people.
During interrogations, Spesivtsev confessed to 15 murders, though the exact number of victims remains unknown. Biological evidence was found in the apartment, but analyzing it would have required complex genetic testing, which the authorities couldn't afford. The lack of funding and resources led to rumors and myths that quickly spread through the press. One widely circulated claim was that Spesivtsev took Polaroid photos of his victims. Another, 82 items of children's clothing were found in the apartment, each belonging to a different children. A year after his arrest, in October 1997, Spesivtsev was sentenced for the murder of his former girlfriend, Yevgenia. He received 10 years in prison. In parallel, psychologists and psychiatrists were conducting new evaluations, trying to understand his motives. Spesivtsev insisted that the killings were for the greater good, that the world needed to be cleansed of street children, prostitutes, and what he called human scum.
Spesivtsev saw himself as a purifier, someone with the power to decide who should live or die. He claimed he was protecting society, demonstrating his dominance and his unique ability to enforce order.
He truly believed in his own importance. According to various sources, he even expressed a desire to donate his brain to science, hoping that researchers would study him as a rare specimen.
His crimes were filled with sadism, but also with a thirst for fame. He wanted to be remembered, not as a failure, but as someone feared. "I'm a worthless man," he reportedly said, "but at least they'll remember me for this. I couldn't earn respect, so now they'll fear me."
Despite his belief in his own uniqueness, Spesivtsev felt deprived, humiliated, and blamed women for his sexual failures. By the time he was arrested, he was in fact suffering from impotence. But it wasn't caused by ridicule from women. It was the result of an injury he inflicted on himself. During his first stay at a psychiatric hospital, Spesivtsev inserted a makeshift piercing into his genitals. The wound became infected, caused him unbearable pain, and ultimately led to serious complications.
The question of his cannibalism deserves separate consideration. I don't think he was trying to feed himself in the literal sense. This was something else entirely. I believe what we're seeing here is a drive to consume what had caused him the most traumatic emotional experiences. And it was exactly that urge that pushed him to eat those children. The act of eating them also reflected his overall attitude toward people in general.
The investigation into Spesivtsev's crimes lasted 2 years, but during that time, investigators were only able to prove 4 murders. The 3 girls from the hospital and 20-year-old Yelena Trunova.
The trial was closed to the public, and many of the horrific details that made it into the case files. It felt like people were almost embarrassed to say them out loud. For example, the fact that there was cannibalism and that parts of human bodies were fed to an animal, that same dog, was something people tried to avoid mentioning altogether. Yes, it's in the official materials, but in court it was barely addressed directly, only in passing. I think ultimately that's because even for people within the legal system, some things are just too hard to face.
Experts declared him legally insane. In 1999, a court ruled that Spesivtsev should be sent for involuntary psychiatric treatment.
If he had been declared sane, society might have found some reassurance in a long prison sentence, because while he could eventually be released from a psychiatric hospital, he would never have been released from prison. But on the other hand, it felt like the system was trying to say a normal person couldn't have done this, that this was solely the result of a mental illness.
It was a convenient solution, really. They basically tucked him away, pulled him out of sight, and assumed that would be the end of it. He went to a psychiatric hospital and people would just forget. Sure, maybe a major TV channel would run another episode of Criminal Russia that mentions him in passing. But the general idea was, turn the page, move on. What no one expected was that his image would take on a life of its own, in social media, online. Although, honestly, I think if he had been given a life sentence, there's a good chance he might not even be alive today.
60-year-old Lyudmila Spesivtseva also appeared in court. The woman did not deny that she herself brought his future victims to her son and then buried their remains. Before her death, Olya, the last surviving girl, managed to give detailed testimony to the investigators. Thanks to her testimony, Lyudmila was found guilty of kidnapping 3 girls and complicity in their murder under aggravating circumstances. The court sentenced her to 13 years in prison.
Lyudmila was reportedly furious, not with herself, but with her son. She believed he had betrayed her. Despite having done everything for him, he did not shield her when it mattered. But even then, she showed no remorse. She remained bitter, not guilty. She loved her son too much. That love outweighed any moral compass she might have had.
Before she died, Olya also mentioned Spesivtsev's sister, Nadezhda. According to Olya, Nadezhda regularly came to the apartment, just like their mother. But Nadezhda insisted she had only visited once and had no idea what was going on. Ultimately, no charges were brought against her.
At one point in the case files, there were mentions that Spesivtsev's sister might have known what was going on. Even in some of Spesivtsev's own statements, he hinted that she had supposedly helped carry out the remains. But whether that's true or not, we can't say for certain now. She denied everything categorically, and there was no way to prove otherwise, especially since Spesivtsev was declared legally insane. His words, of course, were treated with great suspicion, and in the end, investigators concluded that even if the sister may have suspected something, she definitely didn't take part. Still, we're left with the possibility that we can suspect her of the worst.
She was very much like her mother. There was that same bitterness toward the world around her. And even after all these years, she's still with her mother. I saw them myself walking together in the neighborhood where they live. So whatever's going on inside Spesivtsev's sister, we can only guess. But the facts speak for themselves. She never distanced herself from the family.
In 2008, Lyudmila Spesivtseva was released from prison. For the next several years, she and her daughter lived in a small settlement near the town of Osiniki. Almost immediately after regaining her freedom, Spesivtsev's mother began pushing for a review of his case. She demanded that her son be released from the psychiatric hospital. The apartment on Pioneersky Prospect, where at least 15 people were killed by the hands of a serial killer, remained in the Spesivtsev family's ownership all those years. They continued paying the utility bills and made no attempt to sell the property, though it's hard to imagine anyone would have wanted to buy it.
If you look at the window from the courtyard, it's the same as it was all those years ago, but now it's just black, sealed shut. There's nothing behind it. The apartment is still legally owned by the Spesivtsev family. They're still registered there, but no one lives in it. Their attempt to return in 2013 ended badly.
At the end of June 2013, Lyudmila and Nadezhda Spesivtseva arrived with their belongings at the entrance to their old building on Pioneersky Prospect. It was late in the evening, and the streets were nearly empty, but a group of young people noticed them. They recognized their former neighbors and began smashing their things. It was only the arrival of the police and emergency services that saved the Spesivtsevs from being attacked. That was their first and only attempt to return to the apartment.
I came there myself the next day. I saw it with my own eyes. There was a mattress lying there, broken wooden boards, and shards of glass, I think. The reaction was so strong, so intense, you couldn't ignore it. It just goes to show how deep that wound still is. Even now, it hasn't healed.
The media frenzy that followed the 2013 incident once again drew public attention to the Spesivtsev family. Every time rumors emerged that Lyudmila and Nadezhda had moved to a new town, locals would demand their removal, petitioning authorities to drive them out.
Though now elderly, Lyudmila remained a symbol of horror. People remembered that she had brought victims to her son, disposed of corpses, and, according to some accounts, may have even butchered the bodies herself. The case files contained contradictory statements, some from her, denying involvement, and some from Alexander, insisting she was fully complicit. Amazingly, there was no official surveillance placed on her, no administrative restrictions. To this day, no one knows where she lives or what became of her. We have never heard her version of events, no interviews, no words of repentance. Her eyes, her view of everything that happened, remain a mystery.
For the past 25 years, Alexander Spesivtsev has been held in a psychiatric institution in the city of Kamyshin, Volgograd region. It's said that he spends his time doing crafts, writing poems, regularly eats fruit, receives a disability pension, part of which he uses to buy chocolate, and part he allegedly sends to his mother. Could he ever be released? No. Even if he were declared sane, he would be immediately transferred to a prison colony. But the people of Novokuznetsk still live in fear. Under pressure from the public, former Kemerovo Governor Aman Tulayev sent formal inquiries twice a year to confirm Spesivtsev's status.
Whenever rumors spread that he had been released, police had to issue public reassurances. Spesivtsev is still locked away. He is not coming back. For locals, he became a symbol of pure evil.
In May 2024, the case resurfaced. Investigators reopened the criminal file and returned to his apartment. They ripped up the floors, pulled out baseboards, and took DNA samples from old stains. Using modern forensic tools, they matched the DNA to victims in national databases. Around the same time, a new witness emerged, the boy who had once escaped Spesivtsev's apartment. It took him 26 years to find the strength to speak out.
Now, investigators had forensic evidence, Spesivtsev's own confessions, and testimony from the sole survivor. They reopened the case, this time with 15 proven episodes of murder. In 2024, the case was before the court. Spesivtsev was found guilty on all these episodes. He was again found not incompetent, sending him again for a forensic psychiatric examination. In fact, Nothing has changed for him. But now, at least we know what happened to those people who were still listed as missing.
Some families had refused to believe their children were dead. They clung to hope that the kids had run away, started new lives, or simply disappeared into the chaos of the 90s. Now they know the truth.
Of all of Spesivtsev's victims, estimated to number at least 20, only 2 girls and 1 boy could not be identified. Their burial sites were shown to investigators by his mother, Lyudmila, the woman without whom Spesivtsev likely wouldn't have committed most of his crimes.
She truly was a criminal in her own right. Everything Alexander became was shaped by the upbringing he received in that household. He had severe psychiatric problems, yes, but his environment didn't restrain them. He had sexual urges he couldn't satisfy in a normal way. And so, under his mother's influence, he acted on the opportunities she steered him toward. She pushed him in that direction. Not everything was his own idea. Some of it came from her.
If you look at Spesivtsev, he doesn't look like a monster. He has the appearance of an ordinary man, a plumber, an electrician. And that's precisely what made him so dangerous. No one suspected him. He blended in. And that's why no one intervened in time. Not neighbors, not investigators, not doctors. Even after his first murder, after being released from the hospital, no one followed up. Neighbors did try to complain periodically about noise, about strange noises. But complaints were ignored. Warning signs were missed. This wasn't just a tragedy of violence. It was a tragedy of systemic negligence. That is the true horror of the Alexander Spesivtsev case.
This was the story of Alexander Spesivtsev. Thank you for watching until the end. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments.